بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علم وتقوى وبارك في أوقاتنا وفي أقوالنا وفي أفعالنا وتقبل منا ولا تأخذنا بذنوبنا وقصورنا وظلمنا أنفسنا وأنت الغافر للنادمين، فنتوجه إليك ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك ونصلي ونسلم على الذي أرسلته بالهدى ودين الحق ليعلم الناس الطريق إليك. يا ربنا افتح لنا أبواب الفهم ورزقنا بالحفظ والاستقامة والمغفرة والرزق وأن نموت مسلمين. أما بعد. We reached chapter 2 in the work of Shaykh Abdullah Daraz in Naba' al-Azim, translated as the Eternal Challenge. In chapter 2, the topic is taken up of the source of the Quran, meaning what is the origin of the Quran. One of the things that is key to understand is that Shaykh Abdullah Daraz is a scholar that has studied in one of the prominent centers of Islamic knowledge, which is Al-Azhar al-Sharif. And he combined that education with his studies in the Sorbonne. And one of the things that he did when he went to the Sorbonne is that he began to understand French thought. To contextualize or to make sense of what that means, we have to go back in history a little bit. The colonial powers and European countries at one point in time had a vested interest in the study of Islam for the purpose of politics and the purpose of missionary activity. So there was a lot of stuff, research ideas that were produced, the French language, the German language, and in other European languages, but those became two of the dominant languages in which we saw the development of research. And so one of the things that comes to the fore is this idea of putting doubt that the Prophet ﷺ received revelation. And so there was a set of arguments that were made that the origin of the Quran was the Prophet himself. He was the one that authored it. And so Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is dealing with that reality. The reality of what is the origin of the Quran, and noting that as Muslims, we don't consider the origin of the Quran to be the Prophet. So here says, now the question arises, was Muhammad bin Abdullah, the son of Abdullah, his author, expressing his own thoughts, or was it given to him by a tutor? If so, who might that tutor have been? Some have said that the Prophet ﷺ was taking knowledge from the people of the book. And the definition of the people of the book here is the Christians and the Jews. And so here it says, we read in this very book, the Quran itself, that is not the composition of a human being. It is described as the word of a noble and mighty messenger who enjoys a secure position with the Rabb of the throne, sometimes translated as Lord. He is obeyed in heaven, faithful to his trust. This messenger is Jibreel, the angel who received it from God, the wise, the all-knowing. Then he brought it down in a clear and lucid Arabic language, and that language has uh, that language communicated ideas as they were to be understood by the people of that time period. There had to be a language that was familiar to them, and that was conveyed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he received it as a student receives a text from his teacher. But here, the teacher is the angel of revelation, and is not the people of the book. Is not poetic inspiration. Is not from others uh, that have a claim to or make a claim to a religious text. So that begins to trek out a new direction in Islamic studies. That yes, there's this idea of what is revelation that we find in the sciences of the Quran, but the idea of establishing the source of revelation and ensuring that we are clear that it's not the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that becomes something more important in the current time period to be clear on. That's not to say that in the time of the Prophet himself, alayhi salatu wasalam, that idea was not raised. The idea was raised by people within the tribe of Quraysh, that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam was the source of this revelation. But for much time, that position wasn't given much credence, and the Orientalists, those who were studying Islam and study Islam from a Western perspective, from a Western university perspective, and as a discipline in the university that is rooted in the study of the Muslim world from a westernized Eurocentric angle, or is looking at the Islamic religion from the bias of Western culture. That type of orientation uh, for Islamic studies produced this idea that the Prophet ﷺ was the source of the revelation, and it came from his madness, or it came from borrowing, and so on and so forth. So that became an important point to address because of that reason. So we have a number of different examples in the Quran in which Allah wa ta'ala is addressing the Prophet. We have the ayat that says, Prophet, why do you impose on yourself a prohibition of something that God has made lawful to you only to please your wives? Another verse, you would hide within yourself something that God was sure to bring to light, fearing what people may think, whereas it is God alone whom you should fear. May God pardon you, Prophet. Why have you granted them permission to stay home before you come to realize who was speaking the truth and before you come to know the liars? Then it does not behoove the Prophet ﷺ and the believers to pray for forgiveness of those who associated partners with God, even though they happen to be their near of kin or family, after it has been made clear to them, that they are destined for hell. And lastly, but to the one who considered himself self-sufficient, you were all attention. Yet the fault would not be yours if he remained unclean. As to him who comes to you with zeal and with a feeling of fear in his heart, him you ignore and busy yourself with triviality. So here in these ayat of the Quran, without going into all of the details of them, they contain a reproach. Shaykh Abdullah Daraz says, let us reflect on these ayat and the reproach they contain. Had they been the expression of Muhammad's remorse and feelings of guilt and sorrow when he realized his mistakes, would he have spoken about himself in such a strongly reproachful manner? Would he not have preferred to keep quiet in order to maintain respect for his own views and orders? Indeed, had the Quran been the product of his own conscience, he would have suppressed some parts of it when the need arose. And had he wished to suppress any part of it, then such verses would be the first to be suppressed. But the Quran is God's own revelation, and Muhammad could not suppress any part of it. He does not begrudge others the secrets of what is unseen. Is an ayat that is referred to. Consider very carefully the following verses from uh, the 8th chapter, the spoils of war, and you will find something very peculiar about the case to which they refer. It does not behoove a prophet to take captives unless he has battled strenuously and shed blood on earth. You may deserve the fleeting gains of this world, but God desires for you the life to come. God is almighty, wise. Had it not been for a decree from God that had already gone forth, there would indeed have befallen you upon you a tremendous punishment on account of what you have taken. Enjoy then what you have gained as lawful and good, and remain conscious of God. God is indeed much forgiving, merciful. These verses were revealed only after the captives in the battle of Badr were released and ransom was accepted from them. They start with a denunciation of this action as wrong and conclude with approving it and consoling the Prophet and his companions. Indeed, this precedent, which earned reproach, became the rule to be applied in similar cases. Had this statement been made by Muhammad himself, it is conceivable that a psychological condition which produces beginning could produce its conclusion without any period of time to intervene between the initial rebuke and the remonstration and the ultimate approval. Certainly not. If we were to imagine that these two thoughts followed each other within any one person's soul, the later would have cancelled the former. The final thought would have approved what was actually done. What would be the reason then for describing the thought that was cancelled and erased and recording it in such a way that implied a public rebuke? Why would the Quran, why would the gain, that was described as lawful and good be shown first to be at least undesirable? What psychologists understand from this text is that there are two entirely separate beings. One of them, a master, saying to Sir, you have done badly, but I pardon you and permit you to benefit by what you have done. If you examine these errors for which the Prophet is reproached, you are bound to conclude that they share a common denominator. When the Prophet ﷺ had to choose between two options and found that neither involved anything prohibited, he would always choose what was more compassionate, more likely to win over his people to accept God's guidance or to soften the hostility of his opponents. He would always choose the option that was less harsh and unlikely to raise doubts about divine faith. At no time with regard to these incidents did he have a clear text which he willfully disobeyed or forgetfully breached. All that he did was to consider and reflect. When he felt that he had a choice, he chose the option closer to his kind heart. All that can be said in such cases is that he exercised his discretion and made a choice. Let us suppose that his choice was mistaken. Would he not, in this case, be justified, worthy of reward? The option he chose was the best that anyone endowed with human wisdom would have chosen. The Quran only draws his attention to what is better according to divine wisdom. Do we find in this any reasonable error that requires rebuke and reproach? Is it not a question of God speaking to his beloved servant and taking him up the road of finer education? So here the argument is being made that the style of the Quran in correcting the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ or guiding him in certain situations. In this case, in these series of ayat that have been presented, is one of reproach and rebuke. He's being publicly corrected. So the reality of the situation is that it was a text, the argument is being made, that was composed by the Prophet ﷺ. Would it not be more logical to eliminate that type of public rebuke because it takes away, in some instances, from the standing of the Prophet if he's being shown to be correct? And so that's the logical approach. And so the idea here is to present the position that the Quran is coming to the Prophet and correcting the Prophet ﷺ and serving as a model of guidance. So because of this type of engagement of the Quran with the Prophet, we see within the text itself of the Quran clear proof that the Quran is not something that can be said to be manufactured, produced, constructed, devised by the Prophet himself. Because what it's doing is actually calling the Prophet to transformation and change, or is calling the Prophet to take a different course of action. So then, here showing a dialogue between Allah and the Prophet, so to speak. So, with that concept, we begin to see that within the Quranic text itself, there's a clear demarcation or clear division between who the Prophet is and who Allah is. And there, is stated that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is being given revelation, not the generator of revelation. And so with that, um, we come to an end for this session, and we advise for the students to read chapter 2 because there's more examples, but I don't want to bog you down with that. But that's the general tendency of the section, that it's putting forward an explicatory position. Is putting forward a position, Shaykh Abdullah Daraz, that is explaining why it is that we as Muslims don't believe that the Prophet ﷺ is the origin of the Quran, and why it is that the text itself is showing that it's coming to the Prophet as revelation to guide him in, showing the humanness of the Prophet and the need of the Prophet to be guided by God. Right? And so that is very important for us to be clear on in order to understand how prophethood is comprehended and believed in within the Islamic faith or the Islamic thought and Islamic creed. And so we have basically an outline of what revelation is, in understanding the flow of the Quran, or the way it is that the Quran educates the Prophet. And then we have an understanding of what it means to be a human being and receive that revelation. What does it mean to be a prophet? In terms of this definition of what is the source of the Quran. And so there's a clear distinction made between the angel of revelation, the prophet, and Allah, and the text itself. So the text is shown to be revealed from Allah to the angel Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam, and it's not something that is coming from Jibreel himself, and it's not coming from the Prophet. It's coming from Allah wa ta'ala. So Allah is the source of the Quran. Right? And so that's something to be understood without going into a lot of complexity. Right? Allah is the source of the Quran. And with that we end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.